Imagine you got your vaccine, you're visiting a new community for Shabbos, and you walk into shul, and what's the first thing that you're expecting? You probably expect someone will walk over to you, they'll say Shalom Aleichem, welcome, can I get you a coffee to drink maybe before davening begins? Can I get you something to eat afterwards? Just general welcoming. But then you walk into the shul, and the first thing someone says to you is, "So, are you single?" Sounds odd, right? Well, apparently not as odd as one might think. At least back in the culture, the days of yore, if you want to call it that. Avimelech, back in Sefer Bereshis, back in the book of Genesis, he abducts Sarah from Abraham and takes her for himself. And in his defense to God, he says, well, how was I supposed to know that she was married to Avram and this is adulteress? After all, didn't Avram tell me that she's his sister? So how was I to know any better? Well, God says back to him, according to the Gemara in Testament Beis and Makos, Achsanai hu shabala ir. When someone visits your city, what do you ask him? Al iski achila v'shtia shonoso. Can I get you something to eat? Are you parched from the journey? Do you need something to drink? Can I get you a cup of water? Klum sholonoso ishtechazo achoschazo. You don't ask someone when they first come into the city, is this your wife or is this your sister? How rude, right? Well, apparently that was their culture back then. And maybe we could use this really odd story about Avimelech to understand a verse in this week's Parsha. The verse, Yirches Pasuk Gimel, chapter 18, verse 3 says, Kemaisa Eretz Mitzrayim asher yeshavtem ba lo sasu. You shall not follow in the ways of the Egyptians. Uchemaisa Eretz Canaan asher anei miviaschem shama lo sasu. Nor should you follow in the ways of the Canaanites. Rather, ubechukosehem lo seilechu. Do not follow in the ways of the other nations. Do not follow their culture. Do not follow their pagan ways. Ramosha Feinstein asks, I could have cut this pasuk much shorter. All it had to say was 3 words. Ubechukosehem lo seilechu. Do not follow in the ways of the other nations. Why did Hashem feel a need to specify the Egyptians, the Canaanites? What's that coming to teach us? Ramosha Feinstein tells us, Shelo nachshuv she'osam ha'am nahogim b'derech tova, shebe'emes efshar lismo sheish lahem midos tovos and nechonos. You would think, Egypt back then was a superpower. That was like the first world nation, if you could believe it back then. The Canaanites also were very well established. And one may even back then think of them as being sophisticated and civilized for their time. But we know all of the terrible things that they did, even though that was the norm back then. That was what was considered civilized back then. But the Torah tells us you might look at Egypt and say, wow, that is the height of sophistication. That is the height of human accomplishment. If Egyptians think this is a proper way to conduct oneself, who are we Jews to think any differently? If they define what's moral, maybe we should follow them. They know what the right culture is. They know what the right ethics are. They know what is best for a human being and how to conduct their lives. But meanwhile, it was in those kind of cultures in the Middle East that you had people like Paro, you had people like Avimelech, who the first thing that they asked when someone came to visit their city was, is that your sister or your wife so I can take her for myself? That was established. That was accepted in that culture back then. And I think any reasonable person today understands the absurdity and how barbaric that is. Yet that is what was considered proper in their culture. And what the Torah is coming to tell us when it specifies Egypt and Canaan, it's not just Egypt and Canaan back in those times, but it's a message lidoros. It's a message for each and every generation. That in each generation, there's going to be the Mitzrayim and Canaan. There's going to be the nations that we look at as the pinnacle of sophistication, the pinnacle of morality and ethics. And we're going to be tempted to say, well, if these people seem to be good, we ought to be following what they think is right. Comes along the Torah and says, no, it may not be as obvious as it is to us today that you don't ask about whether someone is married or unmarried immediately when they come into town. But actually, maybe some people, when they come to shul, they do get asked that question right away. But that's another story. But the idea is that we have our own version of Mitzrayim today, our own nations, which are like Canaan today. And Ubechukosem lo seilechu is telling us, don't think just because they appear civilized means that it's necessarily the moral thing to do. Our morality is defined by the Torah. Our morality is defined by God. So B'chukosem lo seilechu wasn't just a rule for back then. Don't act like an Egyptian back in the ancient Near East. Don't act like a Canaanite in the ancient Near East. But it's a message today that we always have to follow in the ways of the Torah. Whether it's something obvious to us, like Avimelech not supposed to be asking about someone's wife, or whether it's the more subtle things that may seem intuitively right to us. But if the Torah tells us otherwise, it's ultimately Hashem that defines what is ethical for us, rather than society. It is God. Good Shabbos.